This is the Enragé, a show where we take a deeper dive into written works published at the Center for a Stateless Society. Join us as we give voice to the ideas challenging the vain phantoms that haunt our social reality and stand in the way of total liberation. For more information, visit c4ss.org. And to support this show or any of the other projects happening at the Center, please visit patreon.com/c4ss.org. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to the Enragé. I'm your host, Joel Williamson, and today we'll be discussing the coronavirus pandemic from an anarchist perspective with Darian Worden, a news analyst, libertarian mutualist, writer, and a historian whose website can be found at darianwarden.com. Darian, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Joel.
Absolutely. So, how did you become interested in libertarian mutualism?
Well, it goes back quite a ways. In the early 2000s, I was involved in the American libertarian movement, Libertarian Party activism for a little bit. But towards the end of the first decade of the century, really felt like, number one, the libertarian movement was kind of moving in a rightward direction from where I wanted to be. And at the same time, I was moving in what we could call a leftward direction, where I was starting to recognize and explore more that it's not just the state. There's all these other things that can oppress people, and there's a lot of ways we can deal with that. And the libertarian movement just didn't seem to hold that. I found the Alliance of the Libertarian Left online, which was a good place, some good folks in it. Roderick Long was big there, Charles Johnson. William Gillis was one of the people who, I don't know if he was technically in all or if anybody really was technically in all. It was kind of a loose network, but that kind of got me into more anarchism and left libertarianism. I found mutualism to be fairly, it made sense. It's a very practical approach. It's kind of, you see what people are doing that's good and you try to get them to do more of it is one of the ways the praxis works on that one. And it's the idea that the market and economic exchange it all can be good, but often it's not good. And it doesn't work for freedom. And it doesn't provide the same kind of mutual benefit that we would like to see. And looking at why that is and how we make it better, I think that approach really appealed to me.
And how are you surviving the pandemic?
Well, it's not been easy. We've lost someone in our family. The isolation's tough, but we're coming out of it strong. We're doing fairly well, getting ourselves together, and we're looking forward to it being over.
Of course,
there's no post-pandemic world. There's just there's a pandemic that some people are able to insulate themselves from. If you can, that's great. But for folks who have young kids, for example, we still got to take all those precautions, but we're surviving. So that's good.
Right. Well, I'm sorry to hear about your loss. That's not easy.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the pandemic, we are here to talk about your article. So for anyone who hasn't actually read the article, could you give the audience a brief overview?
Sure. This was back in May of this year, and there was really a sense that the pandemic was winding down. Vaccinations are becoming more common. It was really looking like vaccines were working out for a lot of people, and we're going to be able to do things that we weren't necessarily able to do safely the year before. And also that, is there an economic recovery? And then also, there's a different political situation, and kind of looking at it from that perspective of what comes next. Is there a back to normal? What are we going to be able to do, and how do we approach this moment in time? And my thesis was that back to normal is not good enough. We got to look for something better. Normal failed. So many people died because of what was normal. And just in general, it just there are a lot of things wrong with the state of the world in 2020, 2019, going back years and years. And I think going forward is the way that we should look at it. We're not going back to normal. We're going forward. We can't undo what's already been done. And, I understand why people want some kind of stability and just kind of being like, all right, let's just pretend that whole thing didn't happen. Let's get back to normal. It's a very appealing mindset. And there's a reason why people are thinking like that. But for me, we got to go forward. And the direction we should go is towards freedom. That's where I kind of focused that essay.
I love it. So it's been about 6 months since you originally wrote the article. If you had to write a follow-up piece on the same subject, what would you choose to focus on?
I think number one, and I kind of talked about this earlier, is that post-pandemic does not exist. It's a slick marketing term to say post-pandemic, but it's not the situation. I touched on a little bit in the original article that things are not equal. Access to vaccines is not equal, and there's still a lot of people who are suffering. And just on a practical level, I mean, kids under 12 are not being vaccinated yet. Hopefully, they will be very soon. So that's a lot of people. And let's be honest, kids are marginalized. They're vulnerable people in society, and they don't get that vaccine privilege that a lot of people have. And for people who are parents, it's hard to decide what to do about that as well. And then going beyond my immediate experience and the experience of my immediate community, you look around the world and this access to vaccines is not equal. So I would go on that. To be honest, I probably wouldn't touch so much on the article about people who are against vaccines or people who don't believe in them. My take on that is, if you just look at the evidence, look at how many people are getting them, it's a really good idea to get a vaccine. So you don't have to take my word for it. But that's all I would say on that. So the number 2 point I would talk about would be mutual aid and how far that's been effective and how far it's been limited. So I would say to that, mutual aid has been fantastic, and really seeing it put into work by just so many different people, so many diverse people, and just helping lots of people out. People acting on their own initiative, they see a need and they try to fill it. They try to make their community better. And I think that's really a basis, or it's a structural piece of this better future that we want to build. But it's not everything. Mutual aid right now, it's great for distribution, but what about the production? A lot of the production is still in this capitalist system. Folks who have more are sharing with people who have less, which is great. But how do we get to this situation where people are not as dependent on those who are more privileged? Privilege is destroyed or dissipated, or however you want to frame that task, and production is done in a more equal fashion. And that's where cooperatives come in. That's where worker power comes in. That's something I was trying to touch on towards the end of the essay when I talk about how worker power and the struggle of workers for dignity is going to be so important, and the struggle of workers for control is going to be so important moving forward. So that those 2 points would be the main things I would say.
Sure. I read that COVID-19 has killed about 22 million people globally. In the article, you mentioned that there are secondary effects of the pandemic. So beyond the massive amount of death that has happened, speaking as an anarchist, what are some of the most important second-order effects that has happened as a result of the pandemic that you think are important to point out?
Well, if we're talking about negative effects of it, obviously we talked about some of the positive community building aspects, but in terms of negative effects, there's a lot. You're not going to have an event of this magnitude with so much tragedy without a lot of far-reaching negative effects that we really have only started to deal with. I think number one, I would say, is just the amount of trauma that we're seeing. You have 220 million people killed. Those people knew people, those people who knew them. it's not really a good way to see someone go. And apart from that, all the emergency workers who had to deal with all this, there's a lot of physical harm that does to people, and I think that's something that it's going to be tough moving on because we don't want to think about that. It wasn't a great time, so that's something that is something that we have to consider. Another thing, of course, is the breakdown of connections. It's not like society breaks down, it's this apocalyptic scenario, but it really did impact people day to day. Some folks who are working from home, or some folks who are in quarantine, they're just not getting the same level of interaction. Maybe they're not even really exercising like they did. It's hard on people. And then for those who are out there working through this, that's daily stress of, am I going to get sick? Am I going to get sick? Am I going to get my family sick? What am I even doing here? People just keep asking more and more. And I think that's something there. And I think that's part of why there's this whole thing of, nobody wants to work anymore. Well, people are tired. This was like we were all in survival mode, and now people don't want to do that anymore. They need some time off. So that's another one. In terms of it's just more negative effects. I mean, you look at desperation. You look at the lines for food pantries, for example, and this is something that's always been a problem: hunger in our society, people who aren't getting what they need, even in the midst of plenty. But really magnified that during the pandemic, and that I'm sure has had an effect beyond what we see. We have to kind of look for that. And lastly, I'd say lingering health effects. People who get COVID and they recover, they sometimes it seems like they go back and they're fine, but some people have lingering illness, and this is something we're just beginning to understand, and it continues to be important. With kids in school and all kinds of issues that we're having.
Right, right. So it's become a popular trope to blame, quote, individualism as responsible for the general inadequate response to the pandemic. Why is this wrong?
Well, I've spent a lot of time, I think, answering a lot of your questions, but this one might take even longer. So I hope we're prepared for that. Number one, why is it wrong? Well, first of all, there's a difference in definition of individualism here that I think a lot of people are working with. So let's start there with individualism. The left kind of has a knee-jerk reaction against individualism because that's something they associate with the right, with like capitalism, and they don't like it. So things that are bad, that's individualist. You kind of get that sometime. But so what do they actually see individualism as? I don't want to put words into people's mouth, but it really seems like it's the idea of everyone's out for themselves. There's no solidarity, there's no cooperation. People are just trying to get advantage and be out for themselves. And I think another way to look at individualism, though, is that every individual matters and what they want matters. Their life and their liberty matters. And there's no good collective without treating individuals well. So that's one thing. But just even moving on from that, let's say with the negative view of individualism, that it's people are out for themselves. I think that this is also wrong. I mean, look at what's going on. I mean, first of all, as I said in the essay, focusing on this neglects the bigger picture and could deflect blame from larger problems: hardened class rule, structural racism, and the authoritarian ideology of the ruling party in 2020. None of those things are really individualist. That's like one group being against another. So when you're looking at the individual behaviors, that's not the problem. The problem is institutional behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like a big thing. If you focus on individualism, you're letting the institutions off the hook. So where did we see a lot of these cases? We saw a lot of cases in prisons and places where workers were exploited. Any place where people were unable to kind of take care of themselves, and we were not given the information in the beginning to take care of ourselves. We were told not to wear masks. We were told that we'll be fine if we go to work, et cetera, et cetera. So those are institutional problems. So then stepping back, so individualism, let's see, who would we say is epitomizing that negative sense of individualism? Well, you can look out there and you'll see people who are not going to do the slightest bit of inconvenience to themselves to help other people. They're not going to wear a mask. They're not going to do this. They're not going to do that. Well, who are they supposed to be sacrificing for? Who are they unwilling to help? And I don't think this is an individual thing. I think this is a group mentality. They are not willing to sacrifice for people who they see as fundamentally different from them. And that's on a group level. What I mean is that, like, you look at, for example, who was dying, especially in the beginning, who was suffering the most in this country. Unfortunately, this is very US centric because that's just kind of where my view has been focused. But a lot of the folks who were suffering the most were people in cities. They were people who were of lower income status. A lot of them had these underlying health conditions that are things that are common among people who are overworked or suffer from environmental discrimination. So this was a population that a lot of people were willing to see as an other, and they were eager to see themselves as better than those people. So it's not like I don't care about a mask. It's I don't need a mask because I'm not one of those people. And that's kind of, I think, a big part of the ideology that people are missing. And that's more of a collectivist mindset, I think. That's another problem with individualism. It's not a case of someone getting on the highway and they're in a hurry, so they cut someone off because they don't care. It's somebody getting on the highway and they see someone in that car that they don't like the look of, so they cut that person off and they're being discourteous to them. I think there's really, people don't want to talk about it so much, but there's really that mindset of, we're the strong, we don't sacrifice for the weak will be sacrificed for our gain. And sacrifice is really a big part of this. People say, well, no one's willing to sacrifice because they're individualists. Well, they actually want other people to sacrifice. They want to sacrifice individuals. They want this to be, something that makes the nation stronger. And within capitalism, you have this sacrifice too. I mean, it's so bizarre to call every person who has to work in the pandemic a hero. They're just trying to get paid. They're just trying to do what they need to do to get paid, and they don't want to risk their lives to do that.
Heroes with a gun to their head.
Exactly. It's like you don't want to be any less safe than you need to be at work. It's like ridiculous the way this was. And what are they sacrificing for? Are they sacrificing for their family? Are they sacrificing so that they can have a better life? No, they're sacrificing, so it's said, because the economy needs them to do that. The economy, it's not even a person, it's a thing that's made up of people. And guess what? The people who are doing the sacrificing, they're not the ones getting the most benefits from the economy. It's the people who are on their luxury quarantines and they're going in their space yachts and all this stuff. And they're the ones who are benefiting. It's not people who are working in the meat packing plant. It's the executives who are like kind of just seeing how many people are going to get killed, because maybe they'll just hire someone else. And I think that's a big part of it. And that's, I think, one reason why this idea that kids need to be back in school is so prevalent. I don't blame parents who have to make difficult decisions about this. But it's this prevalent idea that if we keep kids out of the school for another 3 or 4 months until they can get vaccinated, what's going to happen to the economy? We're going to fall behind. And that's just ridiculous. So lastly, I said this was going to be a long one. Lastly, what was the political view of the people in charge in 2020 and most of the people who we see having problems with vaccines and masks and all this on and on? It's not like they're libertarians for the most part. They're authoritarian and they're against individualism. How many of these people who are against masks were in 2016, 2017 calling people snowflakes derisively?
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to call someone a snowflake? It means, well, you think you're special,
Yeah.
you're not special, and you're pathetic for thinking that. And that's fundamentally against individualism. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's my my answer. Why I think individualism is not a good way to frame this issue.
Well, you make a pretty strong case.
All right,
Yeah.
that's good.
All right, so this is an institutional problem, not an individualist problem, as you say. In your opinion, what's the correct response to the pandemic from an institutional perspective?
Okay, so this is an interesting question. I think we have to make a lot of assumptions for this. So, assuming that what we have are kind of the institutions that we have today, the similar governments, similar capitalist structures. I think there's a lot to be said for the idea that these structures are fundamentally incompatible or just don't really work well for the preservation of individual life in these circumstances. But that being said, the institutions are made of people and people can make different decisions. So I would start by just looking at governments, big corporations. They have a lot of resources, resources can be used effectively to help people out. And I think that had there been different leadership, this could have been done. I mean, just getting the information would be one thing, taking action to say, hey, this is a big deal. You need to figure out how to protect yourself from it and doing a little bit more than what institutions did. I mean, getting masks out to the public. A lot of it was just such a failure of messaging and because it was so politicized, they would say something's bad, then they would say, well, it's not a big deal. Then, do this and then don't do that. And it really undermines the credibility, unfortunately, and deservedly so in some cases. Another thing with institutions is, in addition to resources, they control a lot of decision making power over a lot of people. So, taking a more humane approach to that would have been good. I mean, there were some efforts made to release some prisoners to keep prisons from becoming quite as much of a hotspot for COVID, but not nearly enough. I mean, if you're going to say that we control these people's lives day to day, and then you don't protect them from something like this, I mean, you're at fault. And that goes all the way to the top. I mean, we've seen certainly over the past year and a half that police forces are not just neutral enforcers of whatever regulations get handed down to them. They make a lot of the rules, they make a lot of decisions, they put political pressure. Police forces are political organizations. So there's that. But, when it comes down to it, if you're saying you're in charge of the city, in charge of the state, you got to accept some responsibility and risk for these kinds of things. And, I think not enough of that was done to protect the vulnerable. And I think really, the government has so many resources and these are coming from us. And after just seeing the wreckage of 2020, you got to ask, well, what are we getting for this? Does it benefit us to have this globe spanning empire, to have all sorts of ways to lock up people? And what are we getting from it if it's not protecting us? And that seems like in some ways there was a recognition that the implied social contract had been broken, that the state wasn't protecting people, and that we're now against the authorities. I think that was something that you saw a little bit of. So institutions, the other institution we talked about were the large corporations. I think that there were some efforts to protect employees, et cetera, but once again, not nearly enough, and this is really a failure of culture, I think, to say that you're in charge of these people, but you're not taking care of them. So again, when you have institutions, it's better when people with better values, better outlook are in charge. But fundamentally, that's the problem with these institutions. There's people who are in charge of other people, and they're not the ones who are getting the consequences. They're not the ones seeing it day to day.
What do you think of Biden's mandate that requires all employees belonging to a business of a certain size to be vaccinated?
All right. Well, this is a good discussion to be had. I think that there's a lot of problems with the system. There's a lot of problems with liberals trying to make it work well. But there is a sense of being well-meaning that I think it's important to recognize, if only to have a better sense of what's happening. There's less malice in Biden's actions than there are in Trump's. That said, he's still in charge of U.S. government. He's still trying to be compromiser, and he's still trying to, run the state. So these things are going to be a mess. I think it's interesting that it's requiring for businesses of a certain size. This does seem in some ways to favor smaller businesses, but at the same time, employees of smaller businesses then don't get the same workplace protections. And I think it's tough when you go with these things. How do we look at this? Is this the state dictating to individuals how to live, or is this the state setting workplace protections for people who are currently unable to set them themselves? I mean, it would be great if we had enough worker power, we had strong unions across the country who could say, okay, well, if you're in this workplace, you got to do this. But unfortunately, we don't have that. So, I'm ambivalent about it, to answer your question. I mean, I'm very much in favor of vaccination, and certainly government employees should all be required to be vaccinated. I mean, we as the public are literally forced to deal with government employees. If they're putting us at risk because of their personal decisions, that's a problem for us. When it comes to private businesses, it becomes a little messier. I certainly would prefer to work in a workplace where everyone's vaccinated, but the implementation of that is tricky. As we've seen, even the best intentions, the way the state is run, the way it's enforced, things can get messy. And I think one of the interesting things I was reading is, if you don't have to be vaccinated if you get tested a certain number of times. And I mean, it's really seems like that's just a punitive measure, which if that's what they're going for, okay. But, if you get tested for COVID on Monday and you're negative, you could still catch it on Tuesday. So I'm not really sure how well that part is actually protecting people. So that's kind of where I stand on that. I mean, let's see where it goes. But to sum up, definitely in favor of vaccine mandates for any government employee. When it comes to private businesses, I think maybe a case by case basis is the way to go. But certainly encouraging people to be vaccinated, preferably on a grassroots level, is the way to go.
Relatedly, many people are beginning to articulate concern about the tragically obvious truth that all politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, are happy to lean on the coronavirus as much as possible to defend inhumane policies. For example, the Biden administration is using Title 42 to allow Customs and Border Protection officials to expel undocumented migrants as a part of an effort to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. What are your thoughts on that?
I would say this illustrates the deep institutional problems that we have. And that's how when in my essay, that was one of the things, is that institutional racism, institutional discrimination, and all kinds of bad functioning organizations within government, within the system. And it shows how liberals are invested in a system that really has cruelty as a part of it that's you can't detach from. And in this specific case, I mean, it shows how far Democrats are willing to compromise. They're all for migrants, but then, if it threatens their ability to get things done that they also want to get done, maybe they'll backpedal. And I think that that's a fundamental problem, especially with the Biden approach. I mean, he wants to be uniter is kind of his whole thing, but you kind of have to address the fact that some people, they want people of a certain type to suffer, and that's a problem that you're not going to deal with by compromising. And that's something that we're going to have to look at moving forward, especially on this specific case, with the expelling of undocumented migrants, the repression of Haitian refugees. It's really it's terrible that this is going on, and you don't just fix it by changing some of the optics, like don't have the guys be on horseback when they're beating people up. This goes fundamentally to what the system is, what we want things to be like, and that's certainly a problem. And just going beyond that to more generally, I mean, the logic of the state is to assume control. And I think we saw that a lot with coronavirus related restrictions. Some of them just didn't make sense, closing parks, limiting gatherings of people who, were in households anyway. There's all kinds of stuff that is just evidence that the state's logic is control. It's not cooperation. And really, when it comes down to is cooperation is what's needed to get through a lot of situations. COVID being one of them.
Toward the end of the article, you said, quote, "A lesson of the pandemic should be that we cannot count on authority, but we may be able to build community that we can count on. We should take whatever we can from this moment and run towards individual and collective liberation." What have we learned over the past 2 years, and how does that knowledge inform our efforts in moving towards a freer world?
What have we learned? Well, I hope we've learned the right lessons, but that we can't guarantee. I think certainly a lot of people have learned the lesson that I was saying, that we can't count on authority, but we may be able to build community that we can count on. And I think just seeing institutions fail in such a big way has been instructive. And of course, a lot of people are going to say, well, we rebuild these institutions in a different way with different people in charge. And, I don't know if they've really learned the right lesson if that's their approach. But I think a lot of people are looking at it and they're like, well, we got to do something on our own. We can't just sit at home and go to work and accumulate things and expect the world to take care of itself. This is our community. We have to take some part in it. And that's been something you see with mutual aid just being so widespread. And I don't think that's going away. I think that's something that's here to stay. People are not going to be as involved in it probably, because now they have other things to do and the situation doesn't seem as much of an emergency. But that's fine. The dedicated people are there, the infrastructure is there, and there's something to build off of. People don't certainly need to live a 24/7 political life to make some good in the world. That's something I see as has been a lesson that we've learned. And I think the other thing that we see, especially for the type of workers who they're kind of on either on the margins of the working class, shall we say, that they work but they don't have a secure living. It's kind of ridiculous with some of these people. They're told that well, what you do is not valuable enough for you to earn a decent living. Like, you don't even deserve to be able to live on your efforts. It's kind of what these people have been told. And I think it's kind of come to a head where people are like, no, we're not doing this anymore. You want me to be disrespected for 8 hours a day? Well, you know what? I have something else I can do now. I there's a mutual aid community. There's benefits I can take advantage of. I had time now. I'm enrolling in classes. All this, and then you got other people are saying, yeah, fine, I'll work, but you're gonna need to pay, and we know that you can pay. We saw how much money you made. I mean, just the amount of inequality that was around that was made worse by this. It just really throws things into stark relief. So I think that's going to be a big thing moving on. There's really the community building, and also the sense that maybe the authorities aren't going to help. And I think even people who are more inclined to be favorable towards some of the establishment institutions, I think a lot of them even are thinking, well, you know what, we need a backup plan too. We can't just trust that this is going to work. We got to be really active to make sure this works. That's where I see it.
Do you have any predictions on where this is going?
Predictions are hard to make, but it's also very interesting to speculate on what could happen. I think if we're looking at it now, I think really it's not necessarily what the state does, it's what other things happen and how far the state can either encourage or impede that. And number one, I think, is vaccinations. I believe Pfizer has applied to get approval for kids ages 5 to 11, and that's going to be tested over the next few weeks, or the evidence is going to be examined. They've already done some testing, and that's going to make a huge difference in terms of what happens with a pandemic, because that's like school age kids now are not going to be as vulnerable. And I think, after that, hopefully younger kids next year will be able to. So we're going to have this sense that it's not over, but it's kind of it's not as dangerous. I kind of think that COVID's just going to be in the world now, but people who are vaccinated, I mean, most of us who get vaccinated aren't going to have to worry about it so much. No, and hopefully more people will see that that's the right thing to do. But in terms of what the state is going to do, I think there's probably going to be some more mandates. And, like I said, government workers, we're forced to deal with them. They should be forced to take our safety into account in the way that the best available evidence says they should do. So hopefully that comes into play. In terms of the businesses, I think it's going to be, a bit of a struggle. But in terms of the average person, how much is that going to affect them versus all this other stuff that's going on? I think we look at the secondary effects of the pandemic, all the lingering illnesses, the trauma, people who were victims of crimes due to disconnected people and being in bad home situations. I would hope that there's some effort to address that, but I don't know if that's going to happen on a government level. Hopefully, that's something that people can start doing as we're picking up the pieces here. In terms of people going back to work, that's obviously a big concern. I mean, there's all kinds of debates and politics at high levels. How do we get people back to work? I think that's going to be a big struggle. I think the state wants people working. I mean, I think it does depend on, this is one of those things that does depend on the individuals in the political leadership. Are they trying to achieve some kind of harmony or agreement or new deal in society, or are they trying to push that hardened class rule and make more money and find new ways and new opportunities to harm marginalized people? I think that's what you're going to see. And unfortunately, why do we have a system where that's an option? We gotta think beyond that. That's something I say. The people who are in the government matter, but maybe it shouldn't matter that much. It's tough to make these predictions, but I think that's kind of what we're going to see.
Yeah, yeah, all right. So before we move to the end of our conversation, is there anything I forgot to ask you about that you'd like to touch on before we wrap things up?
I think there's a few things that maybe I'd like to expand upon.
Please, yeah.
One of them is disinformation. And when we talk about people's choice to get vaccinated, that's a very fraught issue, of course, with individual liberty and to what extent their actions are putting others at risk. Now, of course, I wouldn't force someone to go get a vaccine, but like I said, if they're in a position of power where I have to interact with them, by the government, then they should have that. And I think it's important to know who is and who isn't taking precautions, not necessarily just vaccination, but in general, so that we as individuals can act accordingly, for our own protection. We're not going to go out there with a needle and, jab someone, but we can say, well, this person is not doing this thing that I think is necessary for me to protect myself and my immediate family. So I'm going to disassociate from them. I think that's an important perspective. But really, what I was trying to get at here was disinformation. Now, why are people not getting vaccines? I don't think it's most of them have looked at the evidence in a neutral way and said that this is not the right thing for me, or I don't personally need it. The risks aren't worth it. I mean, they're being lied to. They're being lied to by very well moneyed political actors. And it's kind of interesting how this has become politicized. It's hard to keep up with these things, to be honest. I mean, in 2020, the whole narrative was Trump's going to deliver the vaccine. The coronavirus isn't a big deal, but Trump's going to save you from it. Whatever we said last week doesn't apply this week, et cetera, et cetera. And then when he's out of office, first he's trying to take credit for it, even though he really doesn't deserve any credit for it. I personally think the plan was to have a limited number of vaccines available to be doled out to the privileged and just let other people suffer, because that's kind of how things were headed. But now that vaccines are one of those things the liberals like, it's like, oh, well, we're too tough for that. And people are being lied to, is the thing. These are political networks. These are things that people make a lot of money amplifying. And that's something that we have to address. That's something that really is a factor that has to be brought up when we're talking about vaccines and mandates, and how would a libertarian society, how would anarchists deal with this? Well, maybe we wouldn't have these institutions that are telling people not to do the right thing and rewarding people for not doing the right thing. I mean, look at police. How many of police were not wearing masks? How many police were mocking COVID? How many police don't want to get vaccinated? That's a government institution. Okay. That's something that is going to be fundamentally different if society is free. So that's something I would have to talk about. The other thing that I didn't really get into this in the article, and we didn't really talk about it so much in this interview, that's the issue of accountability. How do we hold people accountable for this disaster that we've lived through? And to what extent do people need to be held accountable? And how does that work for different people? I'm talking from the highest levels, where it kind of sounds like they didn't care if it was people who were not like them dying, or people who didn't support them, and they were going to, dole out medical equipment according to who gave them political favors and all that, to, the lower level. What about someone who was reckless or didn't care, and that harmed someone? These are vastly different scenarios that require vastly different responses. But I think that's all something we're going to have to think about. And, also consider that, many of us may have made mistakes. I mean, myself, I think I was very cautious. If somebody wasn't as cautious as me, sometimes, that's just their decision, and I'm not going to fret over it. But when you get people who are actually reckless, that's a big deal. I mean, we talked a lot about Trump, but all the people who encouraged him and kind of gave into this whole, we don't have to worry about COVID because we're the tough guys. I mean, they endangered communities. When they were holding their big super spreader events, it wasn't just them there, it was workers there. It's people in the surrounding communities, and that's all affected by it. And also people who were in charge of things, who had good intentions and tried to do the best they could, they probably made some mistakes too. And we can't just say, well, it would be worse if the other guys were in charge. I think there is a level of accountability that needs to be talked about, and just recognizing that these are different scenarios, and this is tough, and this process is going to be tough. It's going to go on for a while. So that's something I would also say. Let's think about accountability.
Those are definitely important elements to the conversation. I appreciate you articulating that.
Thanks.
So, where should folks go to follow you and your work, to read more of your articles, or to stay up to date with what you are up to?
All right. Well, right now, I'm taking a little bit of a break from writing and activism. Obviously, I'm not just totally isolating myself. Just got a lot going on personally that I want to focus on, at least till the end of the year or so. So I've got a lot of articles up at the Center for a Stateless Society, c4ss.org. I think probably most of our listeners are familiar with that particular website. So you can find me there. I've not been so active on Twitter or on my personal website, just because I've been busy. I mean, currently my Twitter is set to private, but it is there. It's Darian Worden, just DarianWorden. That'll be public again. I'm not going away, just taking a little break. So I'd say right now, Center for a Stateless Society, definitely the place to look at my current and previous work, and hopefully there will be more up there not too long from now.
Sure. Have you ever considered doing radio or podcasting? You've got a great voice for it.
Thanks. I actually did do a podcast about 10 years ago. It was called Thinking Liberty.
Uh-huh.
And it kind of came from a weird place. I was at a Pork Fest, the New Hampshire Libertarian Free State Project gathering, and I met some people there. And I think this might have been after we did a whole talk about agorism, when that was still kind of new to that whole milieu.
Yeah.
And this guy, he had this kind of like Ron Paul type oriented, like libertarian conservative internet radio. It was called back then in New York. So I was on that, got some folks together with that, and then we ended up producing it independently. So that was around like 2010, 2011. We did that. But yeah, not to get on a whole back in the day talk, but I was on a podcast for a while. It's, to be honest, I have trouble keeping up with podcasts. Like, I've listened to this one a bit, but I kind of have to be in the right place to listen, like on a drive, and I don't drive as much anymore, or doing some kind of work that's like the right level of concentration, or the right part of my brain where I can like kind of listen and think about podcasts. So
well, you don't have to listen to any of them. All you have to do is expect other people to be experts, and you get to be in my position and ask them all the questions.
Oh, that's true. That's true. Yeah, I know. I mean, I think podcasts are great, but it's I don't know. It's not a project I've been thinking of adding to myself.
Yeah.
You know.
No worries. I had to. Yeah, you've got a great voice, and had to say that. But
thanks.
All right, Darian. I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you for joining me, and we will talk to you soon.
Thank you.